speakers, as I mentioned. My name is Victoria Edwards. I'm a librarian. 11 months ago, with support from my husband, a doula, a midwife, and a whole host of hospital staff, I became a mother. More impressive, I think, are my co-panelists here. So Mary Bohinsky is a mom of 3 girls and works as a nurse anesthetist. She provides anesthesia to pediatric patients at the bedside and teaches nurse anesthesia at the University of Detroit Mercy. Her work as an anesthesia provider for birthing persons and her personal birth experiences all add to her understanding of childbirth and motherhood. And then Alisha McDevitt is a special education teacher and mom, activist, and artist who brings the experience of motherhood to life through mixed media and written pieces of art. And I'm going to invite Alisha up first to present her performance piece.
After you were born, I attempted to express the masquerade I felt donned in the costume of motherhood. The people around me looked on eagerly, genuinely excited to see what wonderful childhood I was about to construct for you. They huddled around, whispering about instinct, devotion, sacrifice, and the joy and the reward of love and connection one receives in the assumed natural progression and birthright of womanhood. What they didn't know was that I was terrified. I have always wanted you. Since I was 12 years old, I knew your name. But by the time you came into my life, I had already understood how families can hand each other wounds so old they stop being recognized as the fettered shackles they are, and instead shapeshift into identity, tradition, morality, and family values. I was terrified of my inheritance. I was afraid that the unfinished and fractured parts of me would become the architecture of your childhood before I even noticed I was building with them. Every role I occupied felt uncertain and heavy. Daughter, girl, woman, wife, friend, and now mother, written into the margins of my story by the hands of both the familiar and unfamiliar, ancestor and stranger alike. Nurture and culture intertwined so tightly I could no longer tell where one ended and one began. So I made a painting. At first glance, it looked warm, almost idyllic. A tree of life stretched across the canvas, roots deep and sprawling beneath the earth and branches wide enough to hold the full weight of childhood. From one of those branches hung a rope swing, and there you are, suspended in motion, joyful and unaware in the way children are supposed to be. The painting looked safe. It looked hopeful. It looked like lineage transformed into stability. But the tree itself was made from the materials I inherited. Your great-grandmother gave me Mein Kampf. My mother gave me a New King James Version. My Gorilla Glue came from my father, and your great-grandfather gave me absence. These were the tools handed to me to become your mother. And I remember standing before that canvas equipped with the mediums meant for my motherhood and feeling helpless. How was I supposed to stitch together a happy, healthy, wholesome childhood with these threads of hatred, oppression, prescribed femininity, expected fertility, sanctified maternity, ordained submission and silence? Motherhood did not feel like instinct. It felt like seeking asylum in a foreign country with no language, no community, and no letters of reference besides the credentials I could desperately attempt to vouch for within myself. It was painfully obvious that the materials I had been handed were futile in creating the safety, softness, stability, and security I knew were necessary to begin detangling the matted strands of generational trauma and historical inequity within my family's tapestry. And yet, despite how deeply personal this painting was, I strongly doubted my experience was unique. But how was I to truly know for sure? Because motherhood is so often discussed as though it exists in isolation from culture, politics, religion, economics, history, race, sexuality, disability, and power. We speak about it as though it is a natural instinct untouched by social engineering, as though motherhood emerges from the body pure and self-explanatory, instead of deeply mediated by the structures surrounding it. We hear stories about womanhood and motherhood long before we become mothers ourselves. Those stories about what makes a good woman, a good wife, a good mother, and here comes an epic tale of obedience, self-denial, fertility, thinness, softness, submission, productivity, patience, and purity. Stories that often leave very little room for complexity, ambivalence, disability, queerness, trauma, anger, poverty, uncertainty, or humanity. We tell women that motherhood is sacred, but often deny them the language necessary to survive it honestly. Entire generations have been ushered into these rites of passage through silence, through a purity culture that frames sexuality as simultaneously dangerous and obligatory, through religious frameworks that sanctify maternity while dismissing the physical and physiological realities of pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, postpartum depression, rage, grief, resentment, identity loss, sexual trauma, infertility, marriage, bodily autonomy, and maternal exhaustion. Through cultures that glorify sacrifice to the point where many mothers no longer recognize their own suffering as suffering at all, because it's simply what mothers do. And these expectations are not distributed equally. Race changes motherhood. Class changes motherhood. Religion changes motherhood. Immigration changes motherhood. Disability changes motherhood. Access to healthcare changes motherhood. Partnership changes motherhood. Whether your body is viewed as worthy of protection or suspicion changes motherhood. Whether your labor is romanticized, exploited, controlled, criminalized, or erased changes motherhood. I remember how quickly suffering became normalized once it could be categorized as maternal. Exhaustion was expected and rage was unspeakable. Even grief feels inappropriate when in the presence of my children. I inherited these stories early. I learned that womanhood was measured in accommodation and etiquette. Goodness meant endurance. Love was proven through self-erasure. By the time I became a mother, I already understood how to abandon myself so thoroughly that I mistook survival for virtue. I was proud of how many stripes my back took in demand of ordained identity. And underneath all of this said silence. Voice captured by shame. Silence around sex, silence around birth, silence around abuse, silence around bodily pain, coercion, postpartum mental health. Shouldn't talk about that fact that many people enter motherhood carrying trauma that motherhood itself cannot heal and may even intensify. Never hearing about the reality that some women desperately want children while simultaneously fearing the role itself because they understand exactly how much violence, expectation, and erasure has been historically attached to it. Silence protects systems far more often than it protects people. I think that silence increases suffering. Not because motherhood is inherently tragic, but because isolation transforms ordinary fear into shame. Because when people are denied honest language for their experiences, they begin believing they are uniquely broken instead of historically situated instead of systems larger than themselves. I don't want silence to be a part of your inheritance in the way it was part of mine and so many others around us. So we interrupt the silence. The exorcism of isolation and shame is community. We disrupt the suffering with inter-enmeshment. I began speaking with my friends about motherhood without forcing it into performance. I asked them about the tools they inherited to curate an exhibit of nurture in the landscape of nature. I learned from them, and they learned from me. And I learned from you too. You taught me joy, despite the chains of doctrine stamped along the pages of the KJV. I learned to embrace divergence and invest in diversity, despite the grafted book of suffering draining lifeblood from the towering trunk of my tree. You demanded secure attachment and trust built over time, rather than the exasperated adhesion of the obligation of parenthood. And rather than drowning in the disassociative defenses of the denial of self, I forge a path towards the recovery of presence. The more I listened to the stories of others, the more I realized that my experience was not isolated. I am no longer building alone with ancestral instruments of harm. Swing, baby, swing. Don't worry about me. I got this. I always had, perhaps, and now I have help. We are building your inheritance as we speak. And I promise you, we will do our best to defy the sentencing from the court of silent suffering and solitude, and loose you on your own adventure to construct a personhood, womanhood, and motherhood of your own design, with as many materials and mediums as your little hands can carry.
I love this line from Alicia's piece. She says, "We speak about motherhood as though it is the natural instinct untouched by social engineering, as though motherhood emerges from the body pure and self-explanatory instead of deeply mediated by the structures surrounding it." Adrienne Rich coined the term the institution of motherhood in the 70s to describe the patriarchal construct of the modern mother. In this institution, she argues, it is this institution, not the children themselves, that keeps women oppressed and can even impair a mother's relationship with her children. The idea that mothering is a natural instinct is a setup. She says, the institution finds all mothers guilty for having failed their children. A lovely thought to start our Mother's Day too. As Alisha said, we tell women that motherhood is sacred, but we often deny them the language to survive it honestly. Another term coined in the 70s offers us some language, but it's only just beginning to make its way into our regular lexicon: matrescence. This term was first credited to anthropologist Dana Raphael in 1973. She wrote, "The time of mother becoming is matrescence. During this process, this rite of passage, changes occur in a woman's physical state, in her status within the group, in her emotional life, in her focus of daily activity, in her own identity, and in her relationships with those around her. We understand adolescence to be a period of transition, and we have some grace for the extreme mental, bodily, and social changes that we all undergo during that period. We need to talk about this process of mother becoming in a similar vein. We have to lift the veil and improve our media representation, policy writing, and the very way that we all talk about mothers on our day-to-day. So why don't we talk about the realities of matrescence more? Two huge factors are stigma and our patriarchal history. We're going to talk about this throughout our presentation. There's also a liminality to pregnancy, a state of being two in one, between life and death, that isn't easy or comfortable to confront. And then there's the fact that most of the media that we consume does not depict realistic birth scenes. Even women who choose to post photos of their own birth experience on social media are often censored for obscenity. Please note also that not all birthing persons are women. On the next slides, I'm going to use the term women or mothers often to talk about the reality and the history of pregnancy and birth, because these points are very closely associated with our patriarchal history. So there are a lot of other myths that make it difficult for us to have an accurate conversation around motherhood and matrescence. Despite popular media representations, only 8 to 10% of labor begins with a blood or breaking. More often, that happens a lot later in labor. Labor also has, it's important to note, 3 distinct phases. The first stage of labor is made up of 2 different parts. There's early labor, which is when the cervix dilates and thins, and it dilates to about 3 to 6 centimeters. That takes, on average, 6 to 12 hours, but it's not uncommon for it to take 2 or 3 days, as I was very surprised to learn in my own personal birth experience. Active labor is the dilation from 7 to 10 centimeters, and that averages about 4 to 6 hours long. And then there's the pushing stage, which is often what we see represented on our media, usually just a flash on the screen and boop, baby's out. That takes, it can take over 3 hours. And usually that's what happens with a modesty covering, and the woman's on her back, and a lot of other inaccurate representations here too. There's also the afterbirth, which is never pictured. That is the birth of the placenta that happens after the baby is delivered, and that usually happens within about a half an hour or so after the baby is born. It's also worth noting that the US has the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world, 17.9 per 100,000 birthing persons. That is nearly double the next highest country on that list. Throughout pregnancy, many women experience symptoms that are not talked about in popular culture, from round ligament pain to carpal tunnel. Even symptoms that we do discuss are trivialized. So we talk about morning sickness, which most women actually experience all day long, and some women experience to dangerously severe levels, requiring hospitalization. We talk about this roller coaster of emotions That can be attributed to increase in hormone levels that far outpaces what we experience during adolescence, followed by a rapid decrease in hormones postpartum. This change in hormones is thought to create more neuroplasticity for our brain's developmental changes, as well as some of our physical changes during pregnancy. We talk about getting bigger, and of course we talk about weight gain and advise women to make sure they're not getting too much or too little, hit that sweet spot. There are plenty of other physical changes that happen during this time too. Organs and bones, ribs and hips move and expand. Bone density, feet size, teeth, hair texture, and vision all change, some of those permanently. Some pregnant people experience body dysmorphia and eating disorders as well. In the 10 years following birth, about 50% of birthing people experience pelvic floor dysfunction, which can have long-reaching impacts, including incontinence and pain during sex. In France, all mothers have a pelvic floor physical therapist available to them after birth. That does not happen here. We also talk about mom brain, which is some of these, the memory loss and maternal preoccupation, which can happen to an extent, but it is not a sign of cognitive decline, as sometimes is discussed in our narratives. Some women will have improvements actually in different kinds of memory over time. And studies indicate that moms will self-report worse memory on tests even when they have the same cognitive performance, so we have to be really careful in how we talk about this. We are just starting to explore the impact of parenting on our brains. This image shows the some of the brain changes that neuroscientists are mapping during pregnancy. Researchers think that part of this change alters our reward system so that we have stronger responsiveness to the baby. And we found that similar changes are also seen in dads and other caregivers who spend significant time bonding with the infant in those early days. The history of birth impacts a lot of our bias and stigmas surrounding maternal care as well. Most primates give birth unassisted with relatively little difficulty. Humans are an exception. We often need assistance from other humans to avoid complications in childbirth. The earliest evidence of midwifery is on an ancient Egyptian papyrus in 1550 BC, so this is perhaps one of the oldest professions. Birth also used to be a social event that was largely attended in the medieval ages by women. In the Middle Ages, we see this term gossip actually first emerge around the birth scene. So gossips were close groups of female friends who attended a birth together and then also assisted that woman during the postpartum period. During patriarchal power shifts, gossip comes to mean women who engage in idle talk. And so we see that trivialization of labor. We had a pretty diverse set of midwives here. We had white, Native, and Black women regularly serving the women of their communities as midwives. Male physicians started attending births as well, and they could overrule midwives if they attended the same birth. They also increasingly began to dismiss midwives as folk medicine. I have a picture here of forceps, for any who don't recognize these like little spoon tools. Forceps were developed in the late 15th century, and they were a closely guarded secret monopolized by one family. They rode that power pretty high. They ended up serving the royal family and delivering several royal children over the years. But by the 1700s, the design had been sold for mass market, and it was being used by male midwives. It doubtlessly saved lives, although it is difficult to quantify how many in this time period. Female midwives were seen as unskilled and unable to properly handle the tool. So they were not given access to this potentially life-saving technology. Never mind that men also didn't handle it properly sometimes, and also didn't always clean it. By the 1800s, we see the father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, found the first female hospital. We start to see more female hospitals rise up during this time, and midwives are not invited into those spaces. We also see the use of anesthetics rise, and hospitals have the drugs, and women want the drugs during childbirth. So we start to see this movement and shift towards birth in a hospital setting. By the early 1900s, hospital sterilization processes improved, thank goodness. So Joseph DeLee, the father of modern obstetrics, fortunately advocated for hygienic standards during childbirth, despite the expense. He did also effectively smear the profession of midwifery into oblivion. He called midwifery a relic of barbarism, a drag on the progress of science and the art of obstetrics. This is sort of something I think I want to think about in our post-Enlightenment thinking. Scientific method is great. We have a lot of reasons to support this sort of thing, but who was oftentimes left out of those conversations and those shifting power structures were people on the margins, such as women, especially Black midwives and Native midwives in their communities too. Joseph DeLee complained that doctors in the field would never be paid what the job was worth as long as midwives only charged a pittance for their services. So he also pushed for routine interventions, such as the use of forceps in every birth, regardless of whether there were complications. He pushed for episiotomies, which are an incision in the perineum, which is the area between the vaginal and anal cavities. So he pushed for every woman to have that incision made, regardless of whether or not it was necessary because of complications. And he also pushed for the manual extraction of the placenta, which is kind of like getting up in there and removing the placenta, regardless of whether or not that was needed. It's also worth noting that many midwives also administered contraceptive and abortive care to their communities historically, and this may have contributed to their marginalization in America as well. In the 1970s, women were fed up with feeling disempowered in their birth experiences, and these birth experiences were now routinely paternalistically managed by men with technology in a hospital environment. So we start to see birthing centers, water birth, and home birth emerge as alternative means of birth and alternatives to the hospital model. We also see the return of the midwifery model of care. This offers a more holistic approach to childbirth and doesn't necessarily have those routine interventions from the get-go in the 70s. There's also this now natural childbirth or pain-free birth movement, which proliferates. This is the idea that a mother's fear tenses her body and worsens her birth outcomes. The swing towards this natural childbirth movement leads to a shaming or a bullying of women who need or want medical interventions, the implication being that that is an unnatural birth, which is problematic. Today we are finding some middle ground. So there are now 3 credentialed programs for midwives in the US, offering a more holistic model for women's health and uncomplicated labors than OBGYNs. Certified nurse midwives have graduate level educations and they earn their RN's license prior to the midwifery education. They can practice in hospitals, although not all hospitals have midwives on staff yet, and notably not all insurances cover midwives either. Many hospitals are also incorporating more holistic pain management options. They're offering less routine interventions. They're permitting some use of water in labor, offering a variety of birth position tools, making sterilized birthing suites look a little bit less like those shared hospital rooms and a little bit more comfortable. We also see a rise in doulas. Have you guys heard this term before? Yeah. It's getting to be pretty common. Doulas in the 1970s emerged to refer to non-medicalized support through the postpartum experience. But unlike midwives, doulas do not practice medicine. They only have a select number of clients each month, and they're more able, therefore, to attend a birthing person through the full duration of active labor. Your midwife or your OBGYN is not going to be there holding your hand through the majority of this process. They're going to probably check in every hour to see how it's going and leave, and you're going to be sitting there in pain trying to figure it out for yourself for a while. So doulas offer that emotional support and sometimes advocacy in your medical process as well. In the 90s, research indicates that doulas help lower maternal mortality rates and improve maternal perceptions of birth. And that research was published and launched a training and certification program. Training and certification is not required for doulas. There are now doulas across the spectrum. We have birth doulas, postpartum doulas, abortive care doulas, and even death doulas. So they offer this emotional support across life and death situations. With their lack of medical training and their close ties to the natural childbirth movement by providing non-medicalized pain relief and not having that medical background, doulas are sometimes stigmatized as kind of woo-woo. I ran into this a lot when I hired a doula unexpectedly. But experiences vary widely by doula. Studies reflect that doulas do shorten labor, reduce the need for pain medicine during labor, reduce your risk of needing a cesarean birth, or the need for your provider to use forceps or suctions, as well as help give your baby a good APGAR score at birth. And research also indicates they support and empower pregnant birth partners. They do also come with an expense, and insurance also does not cover doulas. So the medicalization of motherhood is not without its problems, especially regarding bodily autonomy, but the development of some interventions over time has certainly allowed us to save lives. I'm going to hand it over to Mary now to speak more about that.
C-sections most people like to think that C-sections are a relatively new intervention, but in truth, C-sections have been in practice for a really, really long time. This slide goes over some of the historical context of cesarean sections. For those who don't know, cesarean section would be where they make an incision in the lower abdomen or in certain other areas of the abdomen in order to physically get the baby out, as opposed to the baby passing through the birth canal and being born that way. The first recorded C-sections usually occurred after the death of a mother. That was some of the earliest ones that we can find in history, about 710 BC. They were usually performed because the mother had passed and they wanted to quickly get the baby out, and they actually were successful many times in getting a baby out that was still living, which is pretty amazing for that time. In some indigenous African tribes, they performed successful C-sections where the mother did live, and what they did was they would give poppy milk, or the precursor to opioids, in order to control pain in the mother while they did the C-section. Afterwards, they would cover the incision with some herbs, some medicinal herbs that are very similar, or actually some are precursors to our antibiotics that we use today. And they used silver to stop bleeding and silver impregnated dressings to also prevent infection, which is extremely similar to what we, again, use today. So they had it figured out. Outside of these tribes, the first actually officially recorded C-section where both the mom and the baby survived took place in the year 1500 in Switzerland, and actually the mom or the dad of the baby was the one who performed that C-section successfully. Currently, cesarean births account for about a third of all births in the U.S., with much lower rates in other countries. It's been a push in recent years for the U.S. to get these C-section rates lowered, but we do have not the best prenatal care in some areas, or not the best care of moms, and so they're thinking that some of this lack of care of moms and some of this, basically lack of care of moms, lack of research around pregnancy that we have here in the United States contributes to high C-section rates, because it makes moms sicker when they go to deliver. C-sections often carry the myth that they are the easy way out, since the mother doesn't have to endure labor and a vaginal delivery. But in reality, C-sections carry a longer and much more painful recovery. I've had both a vaginal birth and a C-section, and I would have vaginal birth all day long. No comparison. It was definitely the better recovery and easier overall, in my opinion. There is a risk of injury to organs during the process, and then newborns born via C-section can have issues with excess water on the lungs, they call it, because not all the amniotic fluid is squeezed out of their lungs as they pass through the birth canal. So they have issues with that, and also lack of exposure to vaginal bacteria, which is beneficial for them. Furthermore, most C-sections are unplanned, so the mother's at risk of trauma resulting from a delivery method that she hadn't prepared for, including trauma from whatever caused the C-section to become necessary. It's essential to remember that birthing identity is defined by parenthood, not the method of delivery. So we'll talk a little bit about breastfeeding now, which is also called chest feeding, but I'm more familiar with the term breastfeeding. So just keep in mind not everyone refers to it as breastfeeding, and some kind of call it that chest feeding if they identify not as on the gender spectrum. So this is another practice that carries stigma and has evolved greatly over the years. This slide goes over some of the history related to breastfeeding, and I think that it's important to note in some of this very busy long wall of text is that men were usually the ones that pushed for narrative changes that arguably placed more strain on women throughout the history of breastfeeding. Like one example, during the Renaissance, when the men of the church insisted that women work to feed their own children instead of utilizing wet nurses, while the wealthy of the time utilized wet nurses because breastfeeding was considered unfashionable. Later on in its history, formula presented a potential safe alternative to wet nursing in the beginning of the modern era, which gave non-traditional families or people who couldn't breastfeed more options. Around the time when formula became more popular, there was another shift in infant feeding. Formula in the 1960s and 1970s, around the time when it was being developed and mass produced, was extremely popular, to the point where about 70% of infants were formula fed in the 1970s. I remember my mom telling me a story about my grandma. After I was born, my grandma said, "You're not feeding that baby enough." My mom exclusively breastfed me and my sister. And my grandma had, had her babies around this 1960s, 1970s time, and so she used formula for all of her babies. And she would go to my mom and say, "You're not feeding this baby enough. You got to give her formula. You got to get her fatter, because all of my babies were 30 pounds by the time they were a year old." And I was a very respectable 18 pounds at a year old. So it was this push, this like shift in feeding, that now we've kind of like gone to the formula route, and then kind of come full circle back to this push for breastfeeding in the modern era. In this time around the 1960s, 1970s, poorer mothers continued to breastfeed because they couldn't afford the cost of formula. And so this created, at times, a racial divide, definitely a divide in socioeconomic status, but ended up being a racial divide because a lot of the poorer mothers at the time were Black, and they were all breastfeeding still. So it created these racial ideas around breastfeeding. Predatory marketing was also in play. So I realized I probably shouldn't call out the specific company, but there's a large company that exists and was creating and marketing this formula. And so what they were doing in the interest of selling more formula and under the guise of charitable outreach is they were giving away samples to poor mothers in some African countries, or some poorer countries in general, as drought ravaged their societies. And mothers used the formula gratefully until the breast milk dried up and they ran out of the precious formula that they had been given. They were then forced to purchase more, and the expense drove them to dilute the formula with extra water, which led to undernourishment of the babies and many times to electrolyte imbalances, which caused seizures and death in the babies. Many babies also, because of lack of access to clean water to use to mix this formula in those areas, also exposed many babies to severe infections and killed those babies as well. So it hasn't always been pretty with formula feeding. Currently, we have, as I mentioned before, seen a shift back towards breastfeeding, and we're now kind of in this breast is best era, where we realize that the benefits of breastfeeding to babies really are something that we wanted to achieve in our society. And so there was this huge push back towards breastfeeding. And it is true that breastfeeding comes with multiple benefits to both the moms and the babies, but we've pushed moms towards taking on this task, but simultaneously eroding the support systems that were previously used to enable breastfeeding. For example, we expect earlier return to work, and we've organized societies around smaller family households instead of living near or with extended family and elders that had previously helped with child rearing, child caring, and supporting a mom during that breastfeeding process. Breastfeeding has also been altered by capitalism in that we have so many necessary support devices, so that breastfeeding is not free. You need a breast pump, you need all of these support devices, you need a special bra, you need special shirts, you need all of these things that they market to you as necessary in order to breastfeed your child. And so there is a cost then associated, if you buy into that, a cost associated with breastfeeding. Especially if you need to go back to work, because then you do need the pump while you're away from your baby. When I was early in my journey of breastfeeding, they have these cool apps which are free. They're actually really cool and supportive, but where you can time how long you breastfeed, how long you pump, and also track other things related to the baby, which we found really helpful. But when I was timing every minute I spent feeding, I was clocking at least 40 to 50 hours a week, if not more, of breastfeeding or doing some sort of feeding activity. And that's just feeding. So that's not other care of the baby involved in that. So it's definitely a full-time job, and you have to think about that spread over all hours of the day and night. So, you can be up all night feeding a baby sometimes. So I want to open it up to questions really fast. Why do you guys think a person might choose not to breastfeed or to be forced to stop breastfeeding? What are some other reasons that you've heard? Yeah.
Sorry, I could go on. I'm a CLC, so
Oh, yeah.
I could go on this whole day. But
Hope everything I've said is accurate.
yeah, no, it's good. No, for not a lot of the times is the stigma behind doctors too. A lot of the times doctors will push it or push formula over top, as well as the I guess there's a phrase called "fed is best" that's going around, and it minimalizes the breastfeeding because they're saying, hey, you know, as long as baby's fed, that's all that matters. So then moms start to think that they're not good enough or that they need the formula because of thinking, well, at least baby's fed, that's all that matters, thinking that choosing to breastfeed is not feeding the baby.
Yeah.
So I see that phrase a lot, and that phrase is pushed out by formula companies as well. It's a lot with what you said with the pushing.
Yeah.
What'd you say it was? Sorry.
Like the predatory marketing.
Predatory,
Yeah.
right, is a
Yeah.
lot has a lot to do with that. And if you like other countries have higher breastfeeding rates that don't have formula and higher success rates. It's all because of I firmly believe it's
The marketing.
the predatory marketing.
Yeah.
I know you don't want to say the name of the company, but was that company that abused that formula situation, were they ever charged in anything at all to be responsible for all the deaths that occurred?
I doubt it. I don't know for sure, but they're still around today, so whether they paid a fine or something.
What really makes up for that?
I was
Yeah.
going to say,
Yeah.
nothing makes up for that death.
I know I'm not part of the questions, but I think one of the questions that a lot of people have is the access to lactation consultants. They think that breastfeeding is going to be natural for both the baby and for the mother, and with babies that have tongue ties or some other disability, or they're not to term, or there's just too large or too small, too much production, too little production. There's just not enough information to prepare a parent, and then they just say, all right, you can go home, but they don't help.
Either, so trying to get access to a lactation consultant is not something that everybody can afford. Yeah, we'll take one more and then we'll.
I'm here.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I have to sit on the way down here because I'm nursing the baby. I want to piggyback on the nurse, on the lactation consulting. Because when I had the baby, even though I do have the consultant, she actually pushed more for the formula compared to breastfeeding. I mean, she did talk about breastfeeding, but she could have tried harder. But it's just easier to, here's some formula, let me show you how to feed the baby because your baby's starving. But when I get back home is when I realized it takes a long time for my milk to get to the amount that I need, and actually lean on friends and other moms I know to actually try to get the supply. It took 8 weeks to get the baby to have enough milk. But within the first 8 weeks, everywhere I go, it just, he's free formula, he's just, go for the easy way. But once we get hooked on the formula, it's actually very expensive for the mom to have to keep going. But between feeding the baby and having the baby to starve, it's just a very easy to answer question. So for a while, I do feel like new mom, we're first time parents here, we are actually more treating as prey towards this company because we didn't have all the information needed to actually be able to breastfeed. It's just more information about formula feed that is available, easier, rich for first time mom compared to breastfeeding, unless you have friends or mom or you have parents. My mom is not around anymore, she's passed, so I just had to lean on others. But I also noticed some other moms that don't have their moms around to really teach them, so they just become an easy target for this company. So that's what I'm saying. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for feeding your baby.
I hope you guys, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to cover and be quiet. Ignore me.
We tried starvation, but he wasn't very happy.
They apologize.
Yeah, exactly.
Please.
No sorry needed.
I have one more stat that was pretty striking to kind of round out the breastfeeding slide. In the UK, 8 in 10 women want to breastfeed and 81% initiated breastfeeding, but only around 1% of mothers still breastfeed exclusively at 6 months. So that was pretty striking.
What's the reason, Mary?
Um,
What does it say?
Did it say, right?
I think the workplace practices are
Yeah.
a big part of that, but also the social stigma came up when I was finding this statistic too, around like the difficulty of breastfeeding in public. I think it was like 1 in 4 women get unwanted attention from men when breastfeeding in public, so there's a lot of other reasons that make it less accessible too.
Yeah, in your situation, if I wanted to breastfeed, especially with all the equipment, and then I have a couple of kids, and I would be in the library sitting on the floor like they are over there, and you're surrounded by like, it's just, there's not a place where you feel safe doing that, and then you're attached to a child, your other kids are in an unsafe situation, so it just becomes really difficult. And then if you're pumping exclusively, which is what I had to do because of my work situation, you're asking to leave your workspace every 20 to 30 minutes at the very beginning, or every hour to leave for 20 to 30 minutes, and a lot of pushback occurs in that situation.
Even if they nominally say, yeah, you can do it, I would always have to get out of the OR. And the people who came to get me out would be like, well, how long are you going to be this time? You know, just kind of give you that like hurt, so it almost feels like you don't want to.
Those of us who are not in a hospital setting are in a closet, or we're in some sort of bathroom situation. It's not sterile, it's not clean, and when you have, you're hooked up to basically a machine, it doesn't feel maternal at all. It really is difficult.
That is supposed to be improving, but do you want to mention the PUMP Act?
No, I wanted to have that answer. It all comes down to lack of support from community and from doctors and hospital staff and everything. It all comes down to lack of support for the feeding mother or feeding parent.
Yeah, we do have new regulations in place now that require that certain employers, at least over a certain number of full-time hours, I think it is, provide a separate lactation space that is not a bathroom or a closet specifically. I think it outlines. So.
Yeah.
But that is part of the answer, is better spaces too. But
Well, this is a great conversation, but I want to move on so we can get to lunch. So motherhood does not. Just want to make sure it's the right slide. Yes. Motherhood does not occur in isolation from prior experience. Many people enter pregnancy and parenthood already carrying trauma, including childhood abuse, sexual trauma, religious trauma, medical trauma, poverty, neglect, or unstable attachment histories. And so this just kind of goes over some of the motherhood traumas that we could see. What really stood out to me on this slide was the first 2 facts. 1 in 3 birthing people experience a traumatic event during childbirth, and this can be a lot of different things. Like if it's traumatic, it's what you define as traumatic, right? And other people might not think it's traumatic, but it is to you. And then also up to 1 in 2 mothers feel their birth experience did not go as they planned. So 50% of mothers. I had a great birth plan with my first, and it went exactly as I wanted it to. And then the second one, completely different, and the third one, I didn't even bother making a birth plan. Just go with it. I'm going to be disappointed anyway. So. And then maternal mental health conditions are extraordinarily common, and many remain undiagnosed and untreated or undertreated. Postpartum depression, PTSD, a lot of times postpartum depression also presents as postpartum anxiety, which is how it presented in me twice. And not these traditional depressive symptoms, but this just uncontrolled anxiety that I had never experienced before. And yes, Joe, he was trying to deal with it. Why are you so anxious? I'm like, I don't know. It's my body. I don't know. But yeah, so there's a couple of facts up here. And the other one that stood out to me the most is up to 50% of postpartum depression cases go undiagnosed and or untreated. So half of them are not getting treatment that they should be getting.
Is there a reason behind that, Mary?
Society, I think. I mean, if you had to ask me, I'm not sure exactly what the research says, but I feel like it's kind
I did the research for this
Oh, yeah.
particular one. The main reason is a lack of access to support. So not having enough information or support. They don't have a medical team. A lot of these are poor women whose medical insurance stop at the birth and don't extend into postpartum. And so their regular insurance, if they had any, would pick up that cost. And unfortunately, they lost their insurance because they're no longer under the condition of pregnancy.
Many times also you leave the hospital and your next appointment is your kid's first doctor's appointment, and they're not always asking about maternal mental health. It's for the kid, as a pediatrician, they're not your therapist. And that's the American healthcare system. It's also worth noting that pregnancy and early parenthood are periods where domestic violence can escalate. Pregnant and postpartum women in the US are about 3.5 times more likely to be murdered than to die from obstetric complications. And we know that the US has a pretty bad maternal mortality rate, so that's a shocking number. 1 in 4 women experience partner violence during the pregnancy as well. Research consistently shows that this abuse begins or worsens during pregnancy, may begin or worsen during pregnancy because pregnancy can increase financial independence, physical vulnerability, social isolation, and control over bodily autonomy. And importantly, abuse does not always look physically violent. This can also include reproductive coercion, financial controls, intimidation, isolation, surveillance, degradation, and manipulation surrounding parenting itself. Many survivors remain silent because motherhood is heavily tied to social expectations around maintaining that family stability, around protecting our children and preserving our relationships at personal costs, self-sacrificing mothers. In Michigan, we also have a number of identity and reproductive control issues that are worth mentioning here too. We know that nationally, our maternal mortality rates are worse for Black and Native women. I think three times worse on average than for non-Hispanic white women. In Michigan, Black women are about 2.5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women are. And the Black infant mortality rate is 2.5 times higher than white infants in this state as well. Disability also impacts reproductive control in the state. So in Michigan, disabled individuals face ongoing barriers to reproductive autonomy due to historical eugenics, especially this forced sterilization of institutionalized individuals throughout the 1900s. And then healthcare access gaps are a huge disparity as well, and assumptions about one's parenting ability. Income can also, of course, impact reproductive controls. So low-income individuals face higher maternal mortality rates and morbidity rates in Michigan, while Medicaid covers about 40 to 45% of births in the state. And then age. We know that, I think a lot of people know that the teenage pregnancy rates are going down nationally. However, they remain deeply associated with other identities. So Black teens are 3 times more likely to give birth than non-Hispanic white teens. And in our queer communities too, we talk about non-traditional family structures are largely on the margins. In Michigan, this means that the presumption of parentage is limited to straight couples. So when a father signs the birth certificate, it's assumed that he's the father of the child. When you have a lesbian couple and the woman signs the birth certificate, they have to go through an adoption process still, which is incredibly demoralizing to have those same legal protections that are afforded to fathers in the state. So that involves like an at-home visit and legal fees and all these other costs. And then I'm going to pass it back to Mary for a little exercise.
This is the last bit, and then we're done. So, I don't know who watches The Pit here. Yeah. Did you watch season 2 finale? I hope, because I'm going to ruin it.
I have not, but it's okay. I've already seen it.
All right. So, a couple weeks ago, The Pit season 2 finished up. It's this medical drama, and it's not the whole end of, it's just one small case. But they featured on their show a mother who was about ready to give birth and was coming into the ER with no prenatal care, who had decided that she was going to birth at home when the time was right without the help of any medical professionals or even a doula or midwife, that she had been told that she could do this on her own at home. And the Pit and lots of media kind of classified her as the MAHA mom, so the Make America Healthy Again mom, right? Because she had been kind of refusing medical intervention. And what happens on the show is she comes in and she has a headache, and she is very quickly diagnosed with preeclampsia, which is dangerous high blood pressure in late pregnancy and can be very dangerous to the mother. And because she has no prenatal care, no one controlling it, her condition deteriorates while she's in the ER, and she has a seizure. She's diagnosed with what's called HELP syndrome, which is a rare complication of preeclampsia, and ends up having to have, ends up decompensating and having to have an emergency C-section in the ER, at which they perform. And so, you know, she kind of got a lot of issues from the media, from the show itself. Lots of people had issue with her approach to being a mom and birthing. The media had a lot of problems with her, and I just want to reflect for a minute if she truly deserves to be classified as a bad mom, or have we sort of set her up for failure? I had the same thing twice. I had HELP syndrome, but I had appropriate prenatal care, extra prenatal care actually, and I was in and out of the hospital multiple times in the weeks leading up to my deliveries, and still was not diagnosed for 8 or 9 days at a time, despite the second time going in and telling them exactly what was wrong with me. So her coming in and having this catastrophic thing, her, you know, they diagnosed her 30 minutes after she arrived. For me, it took 8 days. So our medical system is just still not really set up to really be informed about women's health care. I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. So I want you to consider for a minute, does she truly deserve to be classified as a bad mom? Or are our biases contributing to promoting women and promoting motherhood, or tearing down moms who may have different choices about how they birth their children? What do we think of her choices as a person and a mom? Do we blame her for them or for her possible health outcomes? What if she had a traumatic birth experience in the past? What if she has a partner keeping her from medical care? What if she's been told by a friend that this is the best way to do it? How will we hold space for future moms we interact with, especially those who disagree with our preconceived ideas of health? And will changing the ideas and notions of those in this room help this mom make different health choices? What if we approached her with more compassion? How could we each influence modern medicine to make room for this mom to be in tune with her body, her pregnancy, her baby, and at the same time make choices that will promote her and her baby's health? I think there are changes that need to be made at the system level, the medical establishment level, but also changes that each of us can make that can help her. Q&A now, though.
Yes, really just time for a couple of pressing questions, and then we'll be hanging out afterwards and you can approach us. Any questions? We covered a lot. Yeah. And the lasagna is smelling pretty good. So, yeah.
So where are we in junior high or high school with like sex ed essentially?
Those teen pregnancy rates and our sex ed systems?
I can answer that.
Yes.
I am in the school system, and I am familiar with this. It depends on the school, and it depends on the state. In our state, we have very, very minimal regulation, like regulated or specified health and sex ed language. and it is only required in public schools that receive funding for that particular grant. If they don't receive funding in that particular grant, they are not required to have anything that is even medically correct. And even in public schools. Does not have to have any science, doesn't have to have any medical background. In charter schools and private schools, there are no set grants. And so they can specify whatever health and or sex ed that they want to. They can create their own curriculum and no one is questioning or asking any questions about that. There are no standardized regulations in Michigan for that.
Do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'm not sure if you, Alisha, or one of the others, but I'm wondering about Mary had said something about the teen pregnancy rate dropping.
It is
Which is wonderful.
17%.
But also now they can't get abortions, so are we expecting that to go up then?
So no, teen pregnancy also includes those who would have sought abortive care as well. And so just the number overall, you know, you're still considered pregnant up until you're not pregnant, and so you still count inside that statistic.
Oh, okay.
However, the lack of access to health care and abortive care would increase the, what we see as a correlation is the increase of poverty, lack of education, continued education, intimate partner violence, and also overall poverty for not just the mother herself, but her partners, her family, and anyone who she's considered dependent or they're dependent on her. So generationally also, generational trauma and poverty in those. So that the strongest correlation between that, regardless if they were abortive or come to full term or adopted, if a teen woman or teen girl is pregnant in any stage, it leads to poverty and lack of and those things.
All right. No other pressing questions. I'm going to move us along here. Take this off. We did have some further reading listed here. So these are books that each of us enjoyed. Yes, take photos and then I'll move on. Also, these are 3 podcasts that I listened to somewhat obsessively. So over the past couple of